But you see, the Earth is in the middle between Mars and Venus. But Venus should not be so hot. It should be warm, but not 900 degrees Fahrenheit.
NASA announced a new focus on Venus after a recent discovery of potential life on the planet back in the 1960s. If you looked at NASA's records, you'd find them referring to Venus as a planet from hell. Around the same time, there was a race to explore space, and Mars became the main destination. This wasn't a coincidence. The Soviet Union was determined to send missions to Venus, even though it seemed like an inhospitable place for life. They kept going until the fall of the empire. Neil deGrasse Tyson helped shed light on the Soviet missions to Venus. Now we get to explore declassified photos taken by the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union fell, it not only changed the world's geopolitics, but also buried many of its secrets. They were known for being secretive, running advanced intelligence agencies, and even hiding potential alien contact. Before the United States took over most of the space missions, the Soviet Union was leading the way. Their main fascination was with Venus, which they referred to as Venera in Russian. The Venera mission spanned from 1961 to 1983. While the U.S. was focused on the Moon, the Soviets decided to concentrate their resources on Venus. It's unclear why the Soviet Union was so obsessed with Venus. Some speculate they might have considered using its surface as a military base, or even had thoughts of colonizing the planet. Given that these missions were carried out during the Cold War, the Soviets weren't transparent about their intentions. Actually, much of what we know about the Soviet missions to Venus comes from recently disclosed and declassified information. Still, it's challenging to determine precisely what they were seeking or if they achieved their secret objectives. The Soviets went beyond just one or two missions. They launched a total of 28 expensive spacecraft to explore the planet, with 13 entering Venus's atmosphere and 8 landing successfully. These sophisticated missions put the Soviet Union in a leading position in space exploration. Although the United States was also a pioneer, NASA focused more on satellites and technology rather than exploring life on other planets. Interestingly, the Soviet space program holds numerous firsts in its achievements. The Soviet space program was known for its secrecy, and after its decommissioning in 1992, much of its archival data was lost or destroyed. This is one reason why we don't have a clear answer to why they sent so many spacecraft to Venus. One possible logical explanation could be cost efficiency. Perhaps the Soviet decision to explore Venus was more about being resourceful with their efforts. Nonetheless, they were genuinely optimistic about the possibility of finding water, assessing solar radiation intensity, and understanding the overall environment of the planet. Without the series of space missions to Venus, it would have been nearly impossible to understand its extreme temperatures and thick atmosphere. Nowadays, many cosmologists doubt that this scorching planet can support life. Its temperatures are so high that they can melt lead, and water is scarce. Additionally, the air pressure on Venus is a staggering 90 times that of Earth. However, we must not ignore the USSR's significant contribution to studying Venus. Disregarding it would be like censoring history. For the Soviets, exploring Venus was essential, even if it was to keep up with the space race. They did consider exploring more habitable planets like Mars, but the costs were much higher than probing Venus. The distance from Earth to any cosmic body plays a crucial role in the expenses involved. On average, Venus is only 40 million kilometers away from us, while Mars is about 250 million kilometers away. Such vast differences in distance also translate to significant differences in costs. The United States.
Looking into the haze of Venus, experts have found traces of phosphine, a possible indicator of life.
That the Soviet missions had technical issues and were unreliable. Their spacecraft was not well suited for covering astronomical distances. and they frequently lost contact with their spacecraft. This might explain why the Soviet space program opted for shorter and closer missions to Venus, which were more likely to yield results. It's crucial to mention the context of the space race when talking about the Venus missions. The United States wasn't even on the space map when the Soviet program launched the first artificial satellite, Sputnik 1, in 1957. This move intensified the geopolitical rivalry between the two superpowers. After World War II, both countries wanted to assert their dominance on all fronts, and space was no exception. These consecutive events have significantly shaped the cosmological pursuits we see today. Both the US and the Soviet Union were obsessed with achieving a groundbreaking moment to claim the lead in the space race. NASA's iconic 1969 moon landing was a monumental achievement that added to their success. However, there were skeptics even then, with some Soviet space experts claiming that the US staged the moon landing to maintain its supremacy. Interestingly, the US initially faced setbacks with its Venus missions in the 1960s, which became known as the Venus Curse. Each probe they sent to explore Venus encountered failures. Seizing this opportunity, the Soviet Union decided to focus on Venus to gain an advantage over NASA. Both nations were determined to win the space race, so they strategically pursued different paths. The Soviet space program aimed to achieve something that their American counterparts had failed to do. Despite limited resources and mismanagement, they repeatedly sent missions to Venus to demonstrate their superiority. On the other hand, NASA concentrated on moon missions, trying to claim their own victory. This strategic division wasn't without tension and propaganda. To hide their struggles with Venus, the American agency sought to discredit the Soviet Union's fixation on the planet through Americanized popular media. They labeled Venus as the hellish planet while emphasizing Mars as humanity's destiny. But the Soviets were not deterred by these connotations. Their goal was to show their superiority, and they succeeded in doing so. The Venera missions, though often forgotten, played a vital role in marking the beginning of the space age. Back in the 1950s, the Soviets started experimenting with advanced probes, which continued for the next 3 decades as part of the Venera program. These missions coincided with the tense Cold War era, pushing the Soviets to optimize their resources. Taking advantage of their heavy lifting capacity in the early years, the USSR built and launched larger spacecraft capable of reaching high altitudes and vast distances. They quickly experimented with both manned and unmanned missions. Their 4-stage rockets and advanced telemetry systems propelled their spacecraft to new heights. It's essential to remember that in the 1950s, technology for outer space exploration and landing on other planets was still in its infancy. These consecutive events have significantly shaped the cosmological pursuits we see today. Both the US and the Soviet Union were obsessed with achieving a groundbreaking moment to claim the lead in the space race. NASA's iconic 1969 moon landing was a monumental achievement that added to their success. However, there were skeptics even then, with some Soviet space experts claiming that the US staged the moon landing to maintain its supremacy. Interestingly, the US initially faced setbacks with its Venus missions in the 1960s, which became known as the Venus Curse. Each probe they sent to explore Venus encountered failures. Seizing this opportunity, the Soviet Union decided to focus on Venus to gain an advantage over NASA. Both nations were determined to win the space race, so they strategically pursued different paths. The Soviet space program aimed to achieve something that their American counterparts had failed to do. Despite limited resources and mismanagement, they repeatedly sent missions to Venus to demonstrate their superiority. On the other hand, NASA concentrated on moon missions, trying to claim their own victory. This strategic division wasn't without tension and propaganda. To hide their struggles with Venus, the American agency sought to discredit the Soviet Union's fixation on the planet through Americanized popular media. They labeled Venus as the hellish planet while emphasizing Mars as humanity's destiny. But the Soviets were not deterred by these connotations. Their goal was to show their superiority, and they succeeded in doing so. The Venera missions, though often forgotten, played a vital role in marking the beginning of the space age. Back in the 1950s, the Soviets started experimenting with advanced probes, which continued for the next 3 decades as part of the Venera program. These missions coincided with the tense Cold War era, pushing the Soviets to optimize their resources. Taking advantage of their heavy lifting capacity in the early years, the USSR built and launched larger spacecraft capable of reaching high altitudes and vast distances. They quickly experimented with both manned and unmanned missions. Their 4-stage rockets and advanced telemetry systems propelled their spacecraft to new heights. It's essential to remember that in the 1950s, technology for outer space exploration and landing on other planets was still in its infancy. They sought to make a defining statement with their first probe designed for the Venusian atmosphere, known as Venera 1 or Sputnik 8 in Western academia. This interplanetary flight was launched on February 12, 1961, and weighed an impressive 1,400 pounds, showcasing Soviet mastery in spacecraft engineering. It's worth noting that not long ago, the Soviet space program triggered the space race with their satellite Sputnik 1, which weighed only 184 pounds. The massive leap in the scale of the space expedition and the spacecraft itself was truly impressive. It's no wonder that the U.S. felt threatened by the ambitious Soviet endeavors in space. Venera 1, in particular, was quite a sight to see. If you were witnessing its launch today, you might notice its striking resemblance to Doctor Who's Daleks. But before getting into any debate about who copied whom, it's essential to remember that the fictional series was released by the BBC in 1963. So the engineers at the Soviet space program weren't inspired by Western media's figments. Regardless of the resemblance discussion, Venera 1 was a sophisticated spacecraft. It was spin-stabilized and equipped with advanced instruments like a magnetometer, Geiger counters, and micrometeorite detectors. Though these specs may not seem groundbreaking by today's standards, we must remember that the Soviets achieved this level of progress with limited resources in the 1950s, which is truly remarkable. Unfortunately, Venera 1 didn't live up to the hype. The first attempt to launch the probe ended disastrously, failing to leave Earth's orbit.
That the surface temperature of Venus is 900 degrees Fahrenheit. That's hotter than a baker's oven. Lead would be molten at that temperature. And when it rains sulfuric acid. And the pressure of the air is 100 times that of the Earth.
Incredible feat. The probe's touchdown on the hellish planet occurred at a distance of about 62,000 miles or 100,000 kilometers, but unfortunately, it couldn't send any data back to the Soviets. By today's standards, we might consider Venera 1 a major flop as it didn't accomplish its intended mission. However, even in a contemporary context, it deserves credit for undertaking such a risky flight into the unknown. Before the successful missions of Venera, we knew very little about Venus's atmosphere. That's probably why Venera 2 didn't achieve remarkable success either. Venera 2 was launched on November 12, 1965, with high hopes. It completed its flyby on February 27, 1966, around 15,000 miles away from Venus, an improvement from its predecessor. However, just like before, the probe faced the same old problem. A radiator malfunction caused overheating, leading to the loss of trajectory. And on March 4, 1966, the mission was declared lost without viable data. The Soviets knew they had to solve the overheating issue for the next probes, Venera 3 to Venera 6. By the end of 1966, the earlier missions like Venera 3 helped them understand the harsh conditions on Venus and make necessary modifications. Although Venera 3 was meant to land smoothly, it ended up crashing into the planet, another failure for the USSR. Despite the challenges of the Cold War and financial hurdles, the Soviets.
Venera 13 landed on Venus on March 1, 1982. The probe survived for 127 minutes before going silent, which was enough time to capture in color what appears to be a bizarre landscape dominated.
But it managed to collect valuable data for 90 minutes before descending into the planet's dense atmosphere. The space agency found very high levels of carbon dioxide in Venus's air and discovered that the planet lacked a magnetic field. After the modest success of Venera 4, astronomers expected the USSR to shift its focus elsewhere. The elevated greenhouse gas levels on Venus usually make it an unsuitable place for life. However, the Soviet Space Agency wasn't ready to give up just yet. Over the next few years, the space program launched Venera 5 and Venera 6, marking significant progress in their ambitious mission. Both probes transmitted back data for almost an hour while descending through Venus's thick atmosphere, a cause for celebration. This new information revealed the planet's atmospheric composition in full detail. Unfortunately, it confirmed what had been labeled as the hellish planet. Venus proved to be unsuitable for hosting life due to its extreme temperature, thick atmospheric pressure, and unbreathable air. All hopes for habitability came crashing down for the Soviet Union. But surprisingly, the Soviet obsession with Venus took an unexpected turn. Even after realizing the planet's low habitability, the USSR couldn't let go of its fascination. Declassified documents and photos from Venera indicate a change in their motivations. After the successful landings of Venera 7 and Venera 8 on Venus, the space program kicked their initiative up a notch. These missions hold immense importance in the history of interplanetary exploration. Despite some challenges along the way, these missions managed to capture images of Venus's surface, making the Soviets incredibly thrilled. They shifted their focus from trying to create life on Venus, which seemed impossible, to searching for life on a planet that other space agencies had overlooked, like NASA. While NASA had its share of successes with missions to Venus in the 1980s, they were more invested in exploring the Moon. Meanwhile, the Soviet space program was optimistic about finding signs of life in Venus's floating clouds. The extent of their success in this mission is uncertain, as much of their detailed findings were not widely shared due to economic struggles. From 1975 to 1984, the USSR faced economic stagnation, leading them to reprioritize and deprioritize the space race. Before the dissolution of the USSR, their lead in the space competition dwindled due to financial constraints, allowing the United States to take over. However, the Soviets had made substantial progress in interplanetary exploration before the shift in power. Interestingly, more scientists today challenge the belief that Venus is uninhabitable. Some suggest that Venus may have once had the capacity to support life, with NASA proposing that the planet had an oceanic past, indicating the potential existence of astrobiological life on Venus. However, the planet's thick atmosphere trapping poisonous gas was disappointing. But in 2020, NASA confirmed the presence of phosphine on Venus, a smelly and flammable gas that would typically annihilate life forms relying on oxygen. Interestingly, the presence of this lethal gas is the most robust biosignature that scientists have been searching for. Phosphine is naturally produced by some anaerobic bacteria that live in oxygen-starved environments like landfills, marshlands, and even animal guts. So, this discovery sparked controversy, but also excitement. The Soviets had been obsessed with finding something groundbreaking on Venus for decades, perhaps based on hunches or strong data evidence. After 2022, The presence of phosphine on the hellish planet became a topic of debate among planetary scientists. Neil deGrasse Tyson, a prominent proponent of discovering habitable planets. Our current technology and the vastness of space make it challenging to send rapid missions to exoplanets. However, observing a planet's atmosphere can offer valuable insights into its habitability, and that's what Tyson believes. The discovery of phosphine has sparked a new era of astronomical interest in Venus. Subscribe for more videos.